Hello, good morning, everyone. Hopefully my presentation will run smoothly without any technical glitches. So thank you. So my name is Philip Hadley. I'm doing a PhD at SOAS University of London. I've just finished the fieldwork part of my PhD, which was a year in North India in the state of Madhya Pradesh, which is in the center of North India, south of Delhi. My working title at the moment is Building Cooperation in Pharma Collectives and Cross-Value Chains. As Laura mentioned, looking at institutional dynamics and power relationships. Just a note to say that what I'm going to mention here is a kind of basically just very initial themes based on initial analysis I've done. So not I'm at the kind of start of that process, but would really welcome any questions and feedback at the end. So next slide, please. Thank you. My overall kind of research question is, or puzzle is looking at how do individuals and groups cooperate to build and manage farmer producer collectives in rural development in North India. Secondly, the kind of role of social context, looking at what role existing social and economic relations play, and if and how they may become redefined and transformed into new institutional norms. And then thirdly, looking at the wider supply chain efforts to build cooperation across supply value chains, how we can understand them. I'm particularly looking at institutions called farmer producer companies, which also in other countries and globally have been called sort of new generation cooperatives. In India, they're a sort of cooperative company hybrid, so that they're based on one member, one vote. But they were introduced in 2002 through an amendment to the existing Companies Act. So they have quite a market focus. They're also seen as being more autonomous from government, and having sort of less restrictions on borrowing and those kind of things. So next slide, please. So just to frame my research in terms of the literature, I was mostly looking at literature to do with institutions in rural development. So I found the distinction drawn by Francis Cleaver and colleagues about so-called mainstream institutionalism and critical institutionalism quite helpful. So within the kind of mainstream approach, which may be a bit of a misnomer because these kind of approaches are also critical, but they kind of put the kind of body of literature on commons governance, so governance of common resources, showing kind of theoretically and empirically how people have set up institutions to manage common resources. There's the literature on institutions from more of an economics point of view by Douglas North and colleagues, the distinction between the formal side of institutions, the kind of rules of institutions, and the informal institutions and their role in mediating economic transactions, in contrast to kind of neoclassical economics. But in terms of critical institutionalism, that kind of refers to the body of work, sort of anthropology, social, historical context of institutions, and the role that may play on institution building. So, for example, the work of David Moss at SOAS on the sort of organizational and social context of institutions, particularly the role of, in India, for example, caste and other power relationships. And the institutions may have a sense of doing their own thinking, as Mary Douglas wrote about. But chiefly, in terms of my research, one of the main distinctions I was looking at was the mainstream approach, which focuses on the kind of planned and designed institutions, so which is evident in the work of the World Bank, for example, in getting institutions right and achieving good governance with the right type of mix of institutions. And then, whereas critical institutionalism may focus a bit more on the kind of unplanned, unpredictable nature, or planned but unpredictable nature of institutions. And then just briefly, sort of research on cooperatives in India, the kind of three main approaches, I think, a sort of managerial technical approach, looking at governance and leadership issues in sort of so-called cooperative success, sociological work, Baviskar and Atwood, looking at social context, and then kind of design approaches, looking at sort of importance of the design of cooperatives. But within all these narrative of decline about traditional cooperative societies in India. And sorry, next slide, please. Thank you. And farmer producer companies are, as I mentioned, a kind of newer form of organization, relatively little literature about them, but a growing kind of case study based literature. But they're sometimes kind of presented almost unproblematically as the solutions to the problems of traditional cooperative societies, and those solutions being more market focused. And then there's a body of literature on social and power relationships. Farmer producer companies are often, I think, I would argue, within the kind of implicit theory is this sort of mainstream institutionalist approach. Next slide, please. So just briefly, my methodology was, as I mentioned, 12 months of field work in North India, and unfortunately cut a couple of months short by the global pandemic, though I managed to do some online interviews to supplement that kind of lost time. I was working as a volunteer in an NGO, mostly a kind of ethnographic sort of qualitative approach and doing kind of project work within that NGO, mostly focused on a project to create a sort of second tier of organization which would support producer companies, which is ongoing. So just briefly, producer companies are usually based on sort of existing local level groups, sort of village level groups, self-help groups, microfinance groups, or other forms of farmer groups. So they're based on producers, so farmers working in agriculture. And I was mostly looking at the sector of organic cotton, so they're producing organic cotton in the west of Madhya Pradesh, and largely also small and marginal farmers with very small amounts of land, also from a so-called tribal, or in Hindi, Adivasi background. So I did a lot of interviews with NGOs, supply chain companies who are getting involved in supporting producer companies, academics, so observation, and mostly looking at collecting narratives of cooperation from different levels rather than perhaps arriving at a kind of more objective understanding of cooperation. So next slide, please. These are basically the kind of initial themes that I've been looking at, and a lot of them are more questions really. So firstly, one of the main things kind of arose from my research was the need for, in looking at the challenges of producer companies, cooperatives, and the NGO basically supports producer companies. Producer companies always have a kind of supporting organization, and in this case, it was the NGO that I was working for that worked to pioneer them in this state, which was one of the first states in India to introduce them. So market access was seen as one of the main challenges. So in meeting that kind of challenge to producer companies that were seen as not doing so well by NGO staff, for example, greater market access is seen as a solution to that. And in the premise for the project that I got involved in was partly that lacking that access and lacking that kind of market skills, market sort of business know-how, so to speak. They needed to sort of focus much more on that. At the same time, a narrative about needing to insulate farmers from the worst aspects of the market. So the recognition that the market is very competitive. You have agribusiness and so forth, and they need to be insulated for a number of reasons. And then secondly, a narrative about cooperation not happening so quote unquote naturally. So within communities. So in a lot of my interviews, I found that there were informal forms of cooperation around harvesting and agriculture, labor sharing, but not really at the level of an institution, or kind of more widely on marketing, for example, production. But then at the same time, the kind of NGO-aided cooperation had been very slowly built over a number of years through work in communities and quite facilitated. And thirdly, a narrative about knowledge gaps. So the knowledge of the NGO professionals, often agronomists or agricultural engineers, community development experts, particularly at the head office level, compared to the kind of knowledge of farmers many of whom were illiterate or very low literacy. Which is also a kind of power dynamic, even though it was a participatory way of imparting knowledge in sort of learning new agricultural techniques and so forth. And then it links to that a narrative about the mindset of farmers amongst kind of NGOs, the idea that farmers see themselves as producers and not owners. So there's a drive to try and get owners farmers to see themselves as the owners of institutions, but this was seen as very difficult because of kind of mindset issues. And linked to that kind of cooperating with other farmers. And then finally, the idea, this distinction between making the organizations self-sustainable versus hand-holding independence. So the NGO aimed at making them sustainable and independent, but informally they'd reflect that there are a lot of issues and they have to do a lot of the kind of back office functions of them. So accounting, registration of these organizations often requires a consultant. There's a lot of legal formalities that for a small and marginal farmer are very generally. Also just the fact that on the local level, the offices of the institutions, the producer companies, were actually staffed by NGO staff. They dealt with the payments. They would go to villages and collect payment and give money to the farmers for their produce. They would collect the share money. So the producers all had shares in the company, and then they would talk about the issues there, and there'd be informal narratives about all those things, versus the kind of formal narrative of the institution as a kind of autonomous member-owned entity. So next slide, please. Thank you. And just moving on from that, so the importance of community work and mobilization. So formally, the producer companies are kind of represented as being sort of member-owned and autonomous, yet at the same time, people would reflect on, perhaps more informally, on the importance of the development work that went on before the start of the producer company. So for several years, building rapport with communities, building relationships, and also wider development work around that. So in a lot of interviews with other NGOs as well, they pointed to this, that being essential before starting an organization. And that's on the other side of that is the recognition that farmers could not start the organizations themselves, or it would be extremely difficult for them to do so. Secondly, in terms of when I was asking people about what they consider kind of successful producer companies, this kind of what I would see as a kind of mainstream institutionalist approach kind of came to the fore. So ideas of kind of good leadership, the idea a good leader can turn around an organization, business planning, having a solid business plan because they're companies with a cooperative basis, and then a strong governance framework. But then informally, lots of narratives about sort of community importance of mobilizing farmers, and also trust between farmers, but seen as kind of secondary. And then also politics. So in kind of one kind of federation of producer companies, so I was talking to the NGO supporting them, and they talked about the need for CEOs, so that each producer company has a CEO working for them, an appointed professional staff member, and they have sort of professional staff working for them as well. So they have to build consensus among the board. The flip side of that is a lot of the NGO staff would talk about producer companies being dependent on CEOs, actually. So and that kind of professionalism being a kind of power dynamic as well. And then whether the directors who are meant to be elected are actually elected or selected, or what does that mean in practice, which seemed to be a moot point. Some people would say they're in practice selected, others sort of elected with an encouraging hand. And then finally, kind of hijacking, influencing, which is seen as a kind of thing in traditional cooperative societies, bar some major exceptions, that their local elites and also government have sort of interfered and sort of patronized them. But with producer companies are meant to be kind of different to this, but actually people would talk about quite examples of CEOs taking over them, running them as their own companies, or maybe more sort of local level influencing. Local leaders, for example, sometimes reluctant to step down from positions of authority through the sense that they had responsibility for the organization, but also you'd have people giving sort of money on credit rather than cash as a kind of service to the community. But at the same time, very kind of farmers saying that they got benefits from the organizations and were in other ways happy with how it was working. But it's difficult to understand the kind of the dynamics there. So next slide, please. So also just a quick note about, so there's the NGO is mostly and had a head office in the capital of the state, and a lot of field office locations where a lot of the projects were carried out. And there was quite a big dynamic between those areas. So you had the kind of suppose, the higher qualified experts at the head office level, and they would often do visits to field office locations, and they would kind of present this narrative of the kind of proper business working of organisations, and often admonish local field staff for their for the problems in producer companies, and the fact that, for example, the procurement of organic cotton was very low at one stage, and they would sort of say that, well, it was because they're not doing marketing correctly and these kind of things, and present them with this kind of quite formal narrative, whereas the field staff would talk about difficulties in getting farmers to sell to the company that they were shareholders of, market traders and the actions of them impacting negatively on the work of the producer company, also just the wider kind of market being very competitive and other issues. So there are a lot of some tensions and those kind of things, and a national and local level. So next slide, please. Thank you. So social context, just briefly. So I found that amongst most of the NGOs I was looking at, they were sort of part of broadly one large kind of so-called tribal or Adivasi community, and at a local level, you could say that they were more homogenous, I suppose, want of a better word. So part of the same kind of village or same area, part of the same kind of Adivasi community, and but in some kind of in the organisations that were federated at a higher level, there were often kind of different communities. So, and one NGO talked about the differences in kind of some conflict mediation that needed to happen, particularly because it was reinforced by big farmers and small farmers in the same organisation. Sometimes the bigger farmers would try to give money to the organisations and would want greater sort of voting rights as a in contrast to the actual rules of the organisation as a in receipt. Also, issue of caste kind of affected the NGO's area of work. So although they mostly worked with kind of tribal areas or so-called tribal areas, or Adivasi areas, they prioritised the poorest areas of the state, but they would try and avoid areas where there were kind of caste tensions. But at the same time, they would appeal to a lot of the rituals and culture of the Adivasi community in training, and also in the AGM, for example, there was the formal representation of the organisation in the banners and the emblems and the name and the documents, which are also all in English, in contrast to the kind of a lot of the members who couldn't really read, who had low literacy. But then they would appeal to a lot of get people to sing songs and appeal to that to sort of build a sense of ownership, which is a kind of open question, I think, about whether people thought it was their institution or a kind of NGO project or a business. And a lot of farmers would say both of these things. So next slide, please. So I'm aware I'm going through quite quickly, but happy to answer any questions later. Just briefly, the supply chain issues. So the producer companies, in a kind of perhaps newer form of cooperation, would form agreements with supply chain companies, often multinational brands in the area of organic cotton, agreements to supply so much cotton, and the NGO would often basically do this kind of work for them and take over lots of the marketing work. They'd form relationships, and also with supply chain companies. There'd be also other organisations that work to integrate the organic cotton supply chain, and they would broker agreements and partnerships, forms of cooperation, you could argue. And farmers were meant to receive a premium. So the price of organic cotton was based on the price of normal cotton with a premium, and that premium was meant to be passed on to the farmer. But there would be often issues where the farmers wouldn't receive them, debates about the level of the premium when I was speaking to a lot of companies and also farmers. And also the global price of cotton would often change throughout a day, and that would affect how much money they would get, the produce company would receive. Often produce companies may not be able to sort of fulfill the requirements of it, of the agreements as well. And a lot of certification and monitoring that is based on the farmer. And often there'd be differences in opinion in these partnerships, and they'd sometimes break down. And often supply chain companies were getting more involved in the kind of NGO work of community mobilization to set up producer companies, because they said, you know, they would receive a secure supply of cotton. At the same time, they had these sort of CSR, so-called kind of objectives. So next slide, please. So I'm just kind of running to the end here, but this project I mentioned was to set up a second-tier organization. Basically aimed at aggregating producer companies. There are a lot of debates about what form it should take. Firstly, a federation where farmers, the directors of producer companies, would have a say in it. But secondly, it moved on to the form of a private company, and there were heated debates about that. So this notion that farmers should be insulated from the market, as well as greater market access, so was key to this. And this quite in the official representation of the meetings, very consultant and kind of top-down led. So they would obviously argue from a kind of informed by their work with farmers. It was this kind of mainstream institutionalist approach, I would say. But actually, there are a lot of informal narratives about farmers, about their skill sets, about the kind of local politics and issues that might influence organizations, that meant that they wanted to take on more control as an NGO in running the kind of marketing of the organizations. And very much this kind of the theory and guidance, the sort of consultants that were involved in it were talking about this kind of value chain governance, transaction costs, these kind of things. Next slide, please. Basically, initially, I think some of my thoughts were around the importance of sort of so-called ecosystem around these companies. So whether they were an NGO or a company or other organizations I was talking to, they all emphasized the importance of almost insulating them from the market and creating a sort of environment where they would be able to sort of market their produce and cooperate, I suppose. So the market environment being highly competitive, and an emphasis on greater kind of business know-how being necessary. I was kind of talking about the difference between formal and informal sides of the institution, and the blending of the two. And then also just the fact that producer companies may be seen as kind of, in some literature, seen as sort of almost like a panacea to problems in development, but actually there are huge wider livelihood challenges in the area. Whilst at the same time, they may be given, farmers may get some benefits from them. And then, so I think there's a question about kind of managed cooperation at a local, national, and international level, and the kind of context of social and context and power dynamics. I'll end with concluding a question, and that's my presentation. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Right, so the title of Maya King's presentation is Why Does Local Agency Matter? Enabling the Policy Space for Aid Recipients. And as with Philip, you'll have sort of 15 to 20 minutes. I'll warn you when you've got 5 minutes to go and 2 minutes to go, although I imagine that you've got it perfectly timed. And then we'll have general short questions at the end. I shall exit now.
All right, thank you. Thanks very much, Amal and Laura, for organising this session, and thanks to all the participants for being here. So this is a paper about local agency and policy space. So it's all about who has control over policy decisions, who has the power to make decisions and control of that. So it's a conceptual paper. It's something that draws on my work experience, and it's something I've been thinking about for a while. So I'm really pleased to present it and looking forward to your feedback. Okay, so this idea of local agency often comes under the heading of ownership. Next slide, please. But this idea of ownership, oops, oh dear, this is the wrong version. This is the old version. Anyway, sorry, this is the old version. Can we have the correct version? Yes, this is the right one, thanks. Sorry, that other slide was a bit more of the background of my career getting to this place, but I think we haven't got time for that. Well, we can talk about it later if you want to. Okay, so thanks very much for changing onto this other one. Right, so yeah, so this idea of ownership is not very precise. So it means that on the one hand, it does mean like local agency and control, but on the other hand, it also means, do donors get, local actors kind of commit to policies that have been decided on by donors already? So those are kind of quite two different concepts. And so this is Fraser and Whitfield's quote pointing out that difference. Next slide, please. Yeah, and so these two extremes of this definition of ownership are often seen in different ways by aid recipients and by donors. So on the left-hand side, we've got a quote about from a representative of the G77 saying, we need greater policy space so that we can truly own our national development strategy. And then on the right-hand side, you have some quotes from donors saying things like, ownership exists when they do what we want them to do, but they do so voluntarily. or we want them to take ownership. Of course, they must do what we want. If not, they should get their money elsewhere. And we have to pressure the local government to take ownership. So these are quite different conceptions of ownership. Next slide, please. And so what this paper is going to do is we're going to look at this idea of local agency. So Fraser and Whitfield's definition, the degree of control recipient governments are able to secure over implemented policy outcomes. And the way we're going to look at that idea is by comparing it to this commitment approach, what I'm calling the commitment approach. So that's on the right-hand side, where we're talking about approaches where donors first choose their ideal policy, and then they choose different methods to try and get governments, leaders, whichever local actors they're dealing with, to try and adopt that policy. So things like conditionality, negotiation, bargaining, these kind of aspects. So those approaches are already often criticized on the grounds of effectiveness, and we're going to try and take a broader view beyond effectiveness to compare these two elements. So before I get into that, I just want to clarify one thing, which is this idea of supporting local agency is often also associated with aid practices under the Second Orthodoxy. But next slide, please. I also want to point out that not everything under the Second Orthodoxy is locally led. So these are just two papers that are showing that either for politically smart approaches or for adaptive approaches, they can be undertaken in ways that are, don't actually support local leadership or local agency. Another example is the recent World Development Report on Governance and the Law, which was talking about, politically smart and adaptive agenda, but actually if you search for the term locally led in the document, it doesn't appear. So we're going to talk about local agency in particular, which may or may not come within underneath the heading of the Second Orthodoxy as well. All right, next slide, please. So the first we're going to look at the benefits of local agency, the potential benefits of local agency in terms of local actors making decisions. And then we're going to move to looking at the constraints and risks that donors might face in supporting local agency. Next slide, please. So, so this section, I'll just be quite brief here. There's more in the paper, but this is kind of drawn from the literature. So there's various different benefits of local agency. So there's a lot of emphasis now on local knowledge, contextual knowledge, and learning. And so kind of necessarily, if local actors are making decisions, then they're using their local knowledge. And also, as those decisions, as feedback is coming and those decisions are being adapted, they could be the ones who are learning as well. So it ensures that that local knowledge is being used and grown if local actors make decisions. Second relates to contestation, mobilizing support. So we need some discretion and policy space if we're going to be able to reach compromises with other groups in society and to try to agree on what we're going to do and mobilize support. Third is the crucial element of accountability. So the point, so this is often talked about, but the point I want to make here in relation to local agency is that you can't really be held accountable for something that you don't have control over. So you need to actually be able to have that power to make decisions if you're going to be held accountable for them. Fourth is process legitimacy. So the issue here is that, if people expect their leaders to be able to make decisions, then if there's some other kind of unclear negotiations that are going on with donors as well, that can kind of undermine this issue around process legitimacy. Fifth is responsiveness and output legitimacy. So here is kind of another type of local knowledge, but the question here is, what do people actually want? And that knowledge about what is responding to people's needs and what they actually are looking for. And I'll talk more about this in a second. And then the last one is authority and coordination. So you need some kind of discretion, you need some kind of power in order to be able to coordinate people around certain goals. Next slide, please. So I just want to focus on a couple of elements in here. First is process legitimacy. So so I used to work in the UK government, and the way as a civil servant, and the way that we used to provide advice to ministers. So this is an example on the left. This is a submission. So you kind of go through the pros and cons of different options. You have a recommendation, and it's quite an accessible document to try and help a minister make a decision about something. And then on the right-hand side, we have an example of a donor report. This is just something that I've dug up from my files. And, so it's quite long, quite detailed, lots of recommendations, but actually no options. and this is, I think this is quite a common thing to see in donor technical advice, that there's not providing options. The option is basically take it or leave it. So this is quite a different kind of advice that you can see given by you know, the technical support or technical advice. Okay, next slide, please. And the next element I wanted to talk about is responsiveness. So responsiveness is discussed a lot in the political science literature, and there's a whole range of empirical techniques to think about responsiveness. So basically what they do is they look at kind of surveys or pollings to find out what citizens are interested in, and they compare that to various indicators of government activity to see if those things match. So I've just done an example here in relation to spending allocations. So this is for Burkina Faso and Uganda, 2 countries that I was able to get data for. And so the green bars show what citizens think were most important problems. So that's from Afrobarometer survey data. And then I'm comparing that to the right-hand side to spending allocations of government spending and aid. And so I'm not trying to make an empirical point with this analysis to say who is more responsive, whether the government or donors are more responsive. And what I'm trying to make here is that it's an empirical question, and we don't need to assume that some groups are more or less responsive to citizens or certain groups of citizens. You know, these are things that we can look at empirically. All right, next slide, please. Yes, and so now we've looked at the benefits of local agency. The next thing we want to look at is the constraints and risks that donors face when thinking about whether local actors are going to be able to make decisions or not about aid spending. So, and after we've looked at the benefits and the costs, constraints and risks, then we're going to think about policy implications. So next slide, please. The first thing so we're familiar with these ideas about different donor constraints in terms of, you know, they're spending taxpayers' money, so obviously they're going to have certain restrictions. They have organizational arrangements which might preclude certain types of working. They need attribution and flag planting. They face credibility problems, and they also have capacity constraints and information constraints. And in particular, in relation to capacity and information, these are constraints that might make it difficult to do the kind of locally led support that comes under the second orthodoxy. So kind of working directly with local policy entrepreneurs and trying to support them in very close quarters in that way. You know, that kind of work is not very easy for many donors. And the information constraints relate to you know, who to work with and who are the people to kind of support in that way, as well as also, you know, what all the information issues I noted earlier about the local context and what ID policies might be. So there's many constraints that prevent donors from supporting local agency, but there's also one key risk. Next slide, please. So the key risk that donors face in terms of supporting local agency is, in my view, that they worry that local actors are going to make bad decisions. So bad decisions, what might that be? So if we want to say something about what good or bad decisions are from the point of view of donors, we need to know a little bit more. We need to go a bit further than this. And so we need to think about donor motivation. Next slide, please. So to think about donor motivation, we need to have some normative content. Like, what is the normative content that is motivating their intervention in aid receiving countries? And so the main dichotomy that we think about is in relation to whether donors are being altruistic or whether they're acting for self-interest. So this is a really, really important distinction. But I think we need to add to that if we're going to think about what donors are worried about in terms of so-called bad policies at the local level. And so I'm drawing on the altruism literature here. So in the altruism literature, there's 2 very important types of altruism. So they're called paternalistic and disinterested. So paternalistic is where you use your values, your preferences to evaluate the effects on somebody. So if you're saying, you know, you think, what would I want if I was in that situation? Whereas disinterested is that you're using someone's own values to kind of evaluate what the impacts are on them. So you're kind of saying, what do you need? So these are quite 2 distinctive issues. Next slide, please. These are 2 different ways of thinking about altruism. And so in relation to donor action, I mean, so they call disinterested and paternalistic. These terms are very appealing terms, obviously. But I think it's important as a conceptual distinction. So, for example, if we're thinking about our own values, there'll be many cases, for example, gender or human rights, when external actors would be trying to, work with their values and try and, change values in some way. Whereas if you think about on the disinterested side, this might be something where, for example, donors are interested in supporting health in some country, but they don't necessarily know which are the biggest health issues, and so like people's views on what those issues might be could play a big role in aid programming. And so what we can do here is we can map these two types of altruism across onto the self-interested and altruistic dimension as well. Next slide, please. And then we can see that there's 4 different kinds of motivations that we can look at. So when we add in national self-interest as well, then we can say we have different dimensions. I'm not sure if these are the right terms here, but there's something in each of these 4 boxes is what I'm trying to say. Thank you. Okay, next slide, please. So if we think about these donor motivations, so what we wanted to say in terms of donor motivations was, next slide, please, was that they think about what might be bad policies in different ways or what might be good policies. So if we think about on the disinterested side and the paternalistic, they both have in common that they would like policies to be based on good evidence, that they will be informed by local knowledge and context, that they will be politically feasible. But they differ in terms of whose preferences they want these policies to reflect. So on the paternalistic side, what they're looking for is that policies reflect donor preferences. And then so the risk of a local agency is that local leaders, local actors might make decisions that don't reflect donor preferences. Whereas on the other hand, the risk, if they use the commitment approach and if they choose the policy they like, they need to make sure they collect this local information and so on, but there's less risk in a sense. On the disinterested side, it's quite different because so the disinterested side, they want the policies to reflect local preferences, right? So this might reflect. So this kind of approach might reflect a donor analysis that leaders are not fully representing an inclusive view of society's preferences. And that's why donors are trying to get policies to change, is because they want those policies to be more inclusive, to reflect the needs of citizens. And so here the risk of local agency is that leaders are not reflecting them. But then on the other hand, there is a risk of the commitment approach. There's a risk if donors choose those policies instead, because donors also don't know what people want. They don't have access to that knowledge either. And so, yeah, there's a risk on both sides for the disinterested donor. So I think here what's interesting is that you might say that the commitment approach could work well for the paternalistic side, but for the disinterested one, we could imagine that the constraints play a much bigger role in pushing donors towards the commitment approach. Yeah, so that it might be that the constraints face an issue. Next slide, please. So let's think about policy implications. So if donors are if disinterested donors are stuck in this kind of, I should say that, obviously donors would have these different motivations at different times in different places. It's not that they're in these different categories in a kind of universal way. So if donors are if sometimes stuck with this commitment approach because of their constraints, even though they actually want local preferences to play a role, then there is a space for innovation, I think, in terms of different policy approaches to deal with this. So as I said before, the second orthodoxy is often trying to kind of directly relax these constraints. So increase donors' capacity to work with local actors, increase donor information so that they can figure out what's going on, their understanding of local context and so on. So I think as a complementary route to that, we also want to have another set of policy options for donors where they can work within their constraints, where they can take those constraints and give them almost. So this is one proposal that's in the paper. I'll be interested in your views. The next slide, please. So the idea is to think about policy space. So rather than choosing a policy, it's more about trying to mitigate risk by trying to exclude bad policies, to try and make it easier for good leaders to choose good policies and make it harder for bad leaders to choose bad policies, but without actually kind of preempting that process in a specific way. So it might be things like supporting information, flexible capacity, but also providing guardrails so that, like any policies which might be more damaging wouldn't go on the table. And so this can deal with donors' capacity constraints and their informational constraints, because we're allowing those the process of policy making to happen without donors necessarily having to manage everything, and also their risk, because we have these guardrails. Next slide, please. So that leaves donors constraints in relation to their credibility constraints, and also in terms of their spending arrangements and how do they manage, provide their need for results and so on. So here I want to say as well that we have space beyond. We have the option to provide stable support. So within the Second Orthodox, we often talk about, this is a kind of complex environment, and so we need to behave adaptively. And so I want to point out here is, if we're using this policy space approach, then donors are no longer the protagonist. Local actors are the protagonist, and donors are kind of playing a third-party role, support, facilitate, enable, and so on. So while the protagonist would need to be very flexible and adaptive, the donor who is providing a third-party support could actually provide stable support. And that might work well with some of donors' existing spending control and domestic accountability arrangements. So what I'm saying here is that that provides more set of options. If you provide stable support, for example, the reference point could relate to the legal framework, country results frameworks, regulatory support, and so on. And I think I'll stop here just to summarize then. So we talked about the benefits and constraints around local agency. We found that the constraints might bind particularly for disinterested donors, and we looked at different ways where they might be able to open the policy space and provide an enabling environment for local policymakers. That's it.
Okay. Okay, good morning, everybody. And thanks to Laura and Amal for having or for organizing and hosting this really interesting and I think very important session. So in my project, I will talk about corporate social responsibility. So I will bring in the transnational private sector as donor. And so I consider corporate social responsibility as a form of cooperation that can kind of appear on any governance scale, including the micro level, which is the focus of today's session. And the study highlights how numerous and very different actors and stakeholder groups are involved in governance and decision-making processes about corporate social responsibility projects. Especially when these projects are supposed to assist very basic local needs, for example, healthcare and education services, and I'll be focusing on exactly these services. Next slide, please. So this is just an overview. I will give you a short introduction, an overview of the constructivist theories I used to gain an understanding of governance, of decision-making about corporate social responsibility. I will quickly introduce the background of the case study in Ghana. And then I will be focusing on governance structures that I did observe in Ghana during the field study, and they will be displayed in stakeholder networks, giving an insight to beneficial as well as disruptive governance tools and instruments, especially on the local governance scale. Next slide, please. So, in order to connect the debate about corporate social responsibility, which was initially a private sector governance tool, to the development studies field, it is important to keep in mind the very unprecedented increase of global economic ties, which do interlink very different localities of production and value creation. And these developments are typically driven by what we call transnational corporations, or in short, TNCs. And as global wealth appears to accumulate in these TNCs and in their home countries, different international agencies request these international private sector entities to assist development in host countries. For example, the Sustainable Development Goals, ending on the notion of the goal number 17, actually, that claims a partnership for the goals and includes the private sector in this claim. And accordingly, the question arises if TNCs have a social responsibility, such as supporting development goals, which do exceed their economic liabilities of profit maximization. And these ideas mirror the concept of corporate social responsibility, or in short, it's CSR. And the debate about CSR, which started about 70 years ago, it defined the concept of CSR as voluntary, as a voluntary involvement of the private sector, and as a universal strategy, meaning that TNCs draft one CSR concept which will be applied in every country of operation. And this voluntary and universal nature of CSR tends to exclude the recipients of CSR projects on local level from CSR decision making. And this creates an unequal donor-recipient relationship, and it creates power asymmetries, or it reproduces power asymmetries. Therefore, the very crucial question is how recipients can govern TNC CSR decision-making, linked to what Maya just said about local actors' inclusion. Next slide, please. So these considerations that I just presented relate to constructivist concepts that include notions of governance, because former studies have shown that very critical aspects of CSR governance are stakeholder dialogue, it's stakeholder participation, and it is about power and the distribution of power between stakeholders in decision-making networks about CSR and CSR projects. But despite this research and this knowledge, there is no holistic understanding of pragmatic governance structures in these networks, especially when it comes to TNC's CSR activities in the Global South. And frameworks such as the agency theory and the policy mobility debate, they can help including the governance perspective in the CSR debate. So next slide, please. Major aspects of the agency theory are principal-agent relationships. And these relationships imply that a principal transfers a specific task that it cannot or is not willing to fulfill to an agent. And in this project, I consider host governments in Global Southern host countries as principals that transfer, for example, tasks of healthcare and education service delivery to TNCs and their CSR as agents. And the governance suggestions from the agency theory, they evolve around an agency contract as core governance tool. And these suggestions provide guidance for CSR decision-making networks, lessening the impact of strictly voluntary CSR decision-making. In addition, the policy mobility discourse can help localizing TNC CSR decisions, overcoming the pitfalls of universal CSR concepts. And policy mobility highlights ideas of revising and reinterpreting universal policies according to the local context and the local circumstances in receiving jurisdictions. And this appears very important as TNCs typically, as the host countries of TNC's operations typically resemble very different receiving jurisdictions, meaning that some of these host countries may need assistance in healthcare and education services, others might be troubled with ecological aspects or similar. And importantly, the policy mobility discourse highlights the very significant role of what I define as mobilization counselors, which are individuals that help revise, reinterpret, and reterritorialize universal policies. And ideally, local and global actors, so recipients and donors, act together as mobilization counselors in inclusive stakeholder networks. Next slide, please. So now I want to focus on the case study of 3 oil TNCs in Ghana. And I chose the extractive industries, including the oil exploration and extraction, because in this sector, CSR is conducted for a variety of reasons, and many of these reasons result in the so-called social license to operate, which is supposed to ensure extractive operations without social interruptions. I will keep it short at this point, but we could talk about that later, I guess. And in Ghana, commercially noteworthy oil discoveries were made offshore the country's coast in the summer of 2007. and the major wells are located off the Western region, which is a region richly endowed with numerous natural resources, but it is characterized by shortfalls in healthcare and education services, especially in the rural areas. So when oil was found, the expectations among the local residents rose that oil TNCs will not only assist economic development, but that they will improve the service infrastructure too. And in Ghana, oil TNCs are not mandated to conduct CSR interventions, but most of the operating oil TNCs do involve in this way, and many of them do so in healthcare and education sectors. For example, there is Eni from Italy, Cosmos from the US, and Tullow from the UK. Next slide, please. So on the map, in the map on the right, you can now see the Western region located in the border region to the Ivory Coast, and it is divided into several districts, which are the lowest level administrative institutions in Ghana. And for this research, the districts were critical because decentralization efforts in Ghana defined the district governments as responsible for healthcare and education service delivery, making them a very important stakeholder in respective CSR decision-making networks. And of interest now will be two coastal districts. They are called Nzema East and Elembele, and they are the actual research areas where I went in spring 2016 and spring 2017 for a couple of months. And I did qualitative data collection in form of observations, stakeholder interviews, focus groups, and expert interviews. And additionally, I analyzed Eni's, Cosmos, and Tullow's CSR reports. Next slide, please. So from now on, I will be focusing on these figures, and there are three of them, displaying the CSR decision-making networks and distinct governance instruments which were applied in these networks by different stakeholders. And this first one focuses on the CSR decision-making network for Eni's healthcare CSR projects in the Elembele district. And to say upfront, Eni's involvement was praised highly by the research participants, and they highlighted the very positive impact of Eni's healthcare interventions, especially in the rural communities in the hinterland. And some of the participants were surprised because these communities do not even experience any impact of Eni's offshore operations, but they were in need most of assistance. And importantly, the results show that Eni accepted local guidance and even localized its universal CSR policy in the Elembele district. And that became obvious because the universal CSR strategy is totally focused on other investment cases, and healthcare is usually funded least. But in Elembele, it's exclusively funded. So critical elements of this CSR decision-making network, which likely supported these positive outcomes, so the positive perception of Eni's involvement, is first Eni's willingness and even the claim to include local stakeholders in decision-making. And Eni wanted to communicate with local agencies, including the district assembly, as well as the recipients of healthcare interventions. And then second, a very critical aspect in this network is Ghana's central government, or more precisely one figure, one individual as part of this central government. It's the former Minister of Energy. And this minister originated from the Elembele district. So in official licensing negotiations with Eni, he pointed to the severe healthcare shortages in his home district. And in addition, the minister connected Eni to the district assembly, making sure that they got along and that they got into a constant contact. And then third, on local governance scale, the Elembele district assembly was crucial in this case, and it applied numerous and different governance tools, actually. So there was a comprehensive midterm development plan. There were binding agreements that the district assembly drafted, and these were signed by ENI and the assembly. Critically, there were takeover plans. So with these plans, the district assembly guaranteed to ENI that it will maintain the initial investments in healthcare infrastructure. And it even offered official support for ENI's healthcare projects in form of construction permits for the healthcare infrastructure. And using these governance tools, the district assembly was able to very strictly guide ENI, backed up by the company's willingness and by the Minister of Energy. So altogether, different constructivist governance elements appeared beneficial in this example. There were incentives, there were rewards, and there was obviously an inclusive network of mobilization counselors. Next slide, please. So this looks very similar and familiar, but what you're seeing now is the CSR decision-making network for Cosmos healthcare CSR projects in Zima East. So this means we are looking at a different company now, and we are looking at a different district. And this comparison in the study, it enabled to define actually promising and disruptive governance tools which were applied in the networks based on the perception presented for the projects. And all considered, and quite contrarily to ENI and Elembelle, the empirical findings show a rather negative perception of Cosmos involvement in Zima East. And Cosmos was especially criticized for its governance approaches. So the analysis shows that Cosmos did not really adapt its universal CSR policy, but it held on to it, although the investment cases presented in this universal strategy did not really meet the local recipients' needs in Zima East. So a critical aspect of this governance network is actually something that is missing in the figure, and it's the error pointing from the district assembly to Cosmos, indicating that the Zima East Assembly did not really guide the interventions by Cosmos. Another important aspect here is that some of the healthcare projects sent proposals directly to Cosmos requesting financial assistance. And by reacting to this request, Cosmos did help the healthcare structures, but the district assembly was not aware of it, and after all, it neglected that it was responsible for maintaining the structures. So Cosmos claimed itself to be aiming at inclusive stakeholder dialogue, and that it used so-called community liaison officers for that, but no research participant even mentioned these community liaison officers, and therefore it seems that this governance tool seems to have failed. Taken together, there was not really any supportive governance following the recommendations of the agency theory or the policy mobility debate. Next slide, please. So I will keep it short to end this section. And just a quick look on this CSR decision-making network for Tallow's education CSR projects in both districts. And one aspect I want to point out here is that there is a new actor on the stage, and it is the paramount chief of Lower Axim. And he represents the traditional Ghanaian chieftaincy system, which is based on chiefs and eldest who are highly trusted in Ghana still. And so in this case, although the district assembly in Zima East again was barely involved, it was the paramount chief pushing Tallow to invest in a senior high school, which was in need of financial assistance for infrastructure construction. And critically, the paramount chief gained access to Tallow because he is simultaneously a member of the board of Ghana's National Petroleum Company. So in this case of Tallow, There was strong guidance for the company's CSR investments, but this guidance was less localized, appearing especially on national governance scale, with the paramount chief and again with the Minister of Energy, which informed Tallo about needs in his home district in Ellembelle. Next slide. So to conclude, the analysis of the CSR decision-making networks of these three companies for healthcare and education CSR projects highlight the importance of efficient and proactive governance actually by local actors that are aware of the recipient's needs. So ideally, the TNCs would include the recipients themselves, even in addition to district assemblies and traditional leaders, which appeared as representatives of the recipients in the case study. And from a constructivist perspective, the local stakeholders ideally become co-principals and mobilization counselors that guide and help localize the oil TNC CSR decisions to make sure that the recipients will actually benefit. And in doing so, and in applying respective governance tools, the host stakeholders can break the power asymmetries between the local recipients of CSR interventions and the global donors of CSR interventions. Thank you very much. That was my presentation. Okay, so what exactly do you mean by the extra programs funded from the profits?
Well, such as the health programs that you described, or health or education or anything other than the extractive activities themselves.
I'm sorry, but I think I do not get the question. So these healthcare and education projects that I described and that I visited and analyzed, they are part of the local CSR strategies by these companies. And CSR, looking from the private sector's perspective and from the extractive companies, they tend to define investment cases that they preferably would like to invest in. And so I was looking at healthcare and education services specifically because those were like real problems in the research area. So that's why we were interested in exactly these investments. But of course, CSR is much wider and it cannot be like limited to healthcare and education services. And even in these services, there are distinctions. So some of the companies, they prefer to invest in primary or secondary education levels. Others are more prone to invest in university programs or in scholarships for university programs.
My question is about the extractive activities themselves. I mean, CSR began as a global agenda by trying to, say, regain a social license to operate for extractive activities, which, of course, are contentious. So I was asking how you make that comparison.
So what we were looking at in the study, it was actually like, yes. So extractive industries have a major impact on the environment, on the society in host countries and host regions and host communities. So what we figured is that so the major aim is always the social license to operate, and there are many minor reasons behind it for the company, and they are economic reasons. But there were distinctions between CSR investments that were supposed to really mitigate negative impact and externalities of the extraction operations themselves. So we came across projects that were supposed to mitigate that the fish stock had decreased around the extraction sites. So people couldn't fish or catch as much fish anymore. So there were these mitigation projects, and there were extra projects, which were these healthcare and education projects. Especially in the case of education, the research has shown in Ghana that it's not entirely external to the extractive operations, because the companies are required by law to employ Ghanaian people. So it's likely that the investments in education will lead to better educated local people, which can be employed by the companies in the long term. But I think there needs to be this this distinction between the CSR projects, which are supposed to mitigate the negative externalities of the extractive operations themselves, and additional projects which they are doing on this voluntary basis, and this idea of philanthropy, actually. But the time was too short to focus on the negative externalities of the extractive operations themselves.
Or perhaps that wasn't your focus.
Or in the study, in the paper, there are notions on it, but the focus was, yes, it was more on these not mitigating but additional projects that were done.
On grounds that they were not formally required, as distinct from the mitigation activities, which in some sense were required. Is that the distinction you're making? It could be an ambiguous distinction in terms of social license to operate and legitimacy.
Yeah, we made this distinction. We kind of came from a different direction, like not starting with the CSR as focus, but we looked at the situation and what local people, which turned out to be the recipients in the end, what they needed and what they defined as the greatest problems in their villages and in their communities. And it turned out to be education and healthcare services and infrastructure. And from there, we followed up, like, do these extractive and oil companies invest in these services? So that's why the study focuses on these service areas.
Yeah. Are these investments in the places that are worst affected by the extractive activities or distant?
That's different, actually. And that depends very much on the companies. So the one example, the Italian company that I presented, they actually focused on the results of needs assessments. And it turned out that it was not those communities that were most affected by the extractive operations, but it was other communities. So they were mainly investing in communities which were not really affected by the extractive operations. It was quite the opposite for other companies, which only focused on coastal communities, which did experience direct impact and a negative impact from the operations.
Right, I might have to draw this to a close, I'm afraid, because I can see we've got a one raised hand and 3 other questions.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a really interesting question. So monitoring is a really important issue here. And again, I need to say that it was really, so I will first respond to how community members were involved in deciding about the CSR projects. And what we observed, it was again very different from community to community, as well between the districts that I was presenting and between the companies. So we observed that some companies went to the communities to talk to them directly and hear about their problems. And then one very interesting approach was that the district assemblies held kind of public hearings, so community members could come and talk directly. So that was another option. And we actually observed cases of CSR investments where no community members were involved at all. It was very different between the companies. So, and then the question about monitoring. Again, a huge range of possibilities that we did observe. We went to 2 communities which had installed like community committees, and they were responsible for observing the day-to-day operation at the healthcare structures and reported to the district assemblies. Monitoring overall turned out to be a crucial problem because there are no real structures in place. So that's why these 2 communities had actually come up with the community committees, because they saw that neither the national government nor the local government would do this job. And we talked to representatives from, for example, from the Ministry of Health, and they were telling us that there is a need, there is a gap. So there needs to be a national agency installed to do the monitoring, but it isn't in place yet. So that's why local structures have emerged to do this monitoring.
Okay, now, and that's a previous question I had asked, what do you think that the CSR really compensates for the extraction?
This is hard to respond with the data we have, because as I said earlier, we were not looking at the mitigation projects. So, and what we were looking at, no, because it's not aimed at really mitigating the externalities of the extractive operations.
I think we might have a slight connection problem. Oh, good, we can still hear you. Oh, excellent, you're back.
Okay, I'm back, yes.
Were you able to hear what?
No, I didn't quite hear her because
oh, I'm sorry. I don't know if you would mind just briefly repeating what you said. Sorry.
Yeah, sure.
I'm so sorry.
Okay, sorry. So, okay. So as I said previously, we were not looking at mitigation projects. So it's hard to tell if these extra projects do mitigate the negative externalities of the extractive operations. And it's really thinking about the information and the statements from the research participants. It was very, very different. So difficult to define if they consider the CSR projects as adequate mitigation or not. On the local level, in the communities, the majority said no, the companies need to do more to really act as good corporate citizens and do something good for the communities.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Excellent. Right, so I can see a few more questions for other presenters. I'm going to try and bring them back onto their podiums.
Okay, I'd like to ask a question. Do you hear me clearly? To Maya in particular, thank you. I really like the idea. I'm sure that local agency or ownership is pretty much well-shared ideas, and I am in it, that one. But I just want to hear more concrete examples or cases where how and in which circumstances local agency can be promoted, because I see more challenges, as you have pointed out, more challenges on the ground. I'm not sure whether your talk was more relevant to the policy level here, but I'm more interested in the ground field work level, and maybe we could think of like local communities. How can we make sure that local communities or local people to have their own agency when they received aid or external support? But I see many challenges in particular because of the donor agency or organization or even government request them to report regularly in their own styles and more frequently than what they could provide, and etc. So that there's a tremendous practical limitations that they can address in terms of increasing the local agencies. So I'd like to hear whether you could bring like more concrete examples. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I totally agree, and I think that this is kind of conceptual paper, so it's not so much an empirical one. So I would really like to collect examples. So I'm really interested to find out more examples and to find out about those practicalities that you're talking about. I think one key element is this idea of options. So there always has to be options, and to kind of think about all the decisions that are being made. You know, this money is coming to this country, it's going to this sector, it's going to this region, and that whole level of decisions change. All those decisions are being made, and to try and think about how each of those decisions could be made by local actors and closer to the people who are affected. So I think it's really thinking about that. You know, there's so many elements going on within aid spending, and it's really trying to think about where those decisions are being made and who's making them. I do think the role of leaders is important. So we're kind of trying to think about strengthening the role of, you know, we expect leaders to make decisions and for them to be accountable to the people who are affecting them. So like trying to kind of bring those groups closer together in some way. I think the reporting issue is really interesting. And I think this goes back to something about like, what are the existing systems? And whenever you add on systems, then you're taking agency away because you're kind of imposing more decisions on people. So if there's some structure that's already there in terms of reporting that's happening or information that's being shared, then to just piggyback on that rather than trying to kind of add other dimensions to it as well. So yeah, it's quite, I'm definitely interested in trying to find out more about examples where this might happen.
Shall I just respond?
Please do. I tried to bring Yobana up to ask the question themselves, but I think they're having a slight internet issue. So
okay. Okay, it's again this differentiation between the mitigation and the real impact. It was for me really interesting to experience these responses, and that I gathered during the field work. So the perception was really different between different stakeholder groups, and it even came down to how are these structures perpetuated. For example, the healthcare structures, there was one community that was really happy and that was praising the interventions because the district assembly had taken over. So there it was considered as a contribution to development, but there were other examples that deteriorated because the structure was once built, healthcare as well as education structures, and nobody took care of it. So that was a big factor. If it was perpetuated, and I think from the company perspective, it is a lot about kind of showing goodwill, because there is even global pressure, especially on the oil companies. And what I think CSR is not the solution. So I think what is needed is something that goes beyond, and it is kind of a cooperation that we're looking for, a collaboration, but I do not have the final answer. So the study we made was more showing which governance tools can be helpful to make CSR a good tool to push for development, but it is not the final tool that will really induce development in oil-producing countries. And still there is the other side of the coin. So the oil itself, as an economic good, can, if used well, induce at least economic development, hoping for the trickle-down effects for social development, if managed well by the state government.
Hi, this is Isabelle Deporte from the International Institute of Social Studies in The Hague in the Netherlands. I have a question for all panelists, but maybe particularly for Philip, because of course the whole panel is about the questions of leadership and cooperation and power asymmetries and who gets to decide and who gets to initiate. So I was just wondering if you could reflect or share a bit on how this worked for you in your methodologically, in your research process and in the in the whole fieldwork process, etc. Thank you.
Sorry, I think I missed the beginning due to your question, due to the connection. I just caught you mid-sentence.
Okay, so I'm not sure what you heard. I just introduced myself and then just said like how this panel was about this questions of power asymmetries and who gets to decide and who gets to initiate different things. And I wondered how this worked out for you, more relating to your fieldwork, methodology, data collection, and the relationships you had in the field. Thank you.
Who gets to decide? Yeah, I suppose, so one of the interesting things that drew me to the topic I was looking at was the fact that they are kind of the organizations I was looking at were member-owned institutions. But then the reality of looking at that, you had a whole range of different relationships mediated by, for the fieldwork I was doing, mostly the NGO that was supporting that, these cooperatives, these kind of producer companies, individuals within the producer companies. So I had to sort of trying to understand the different sort of power relationships between different people in the sort of board of directors of an organization, and also between them and then the companies that they might sort of make these agreements with. I, as like a researcher, found it quite occasionally sort of a difficult dilemma, because I was a sort of volunteer with the NGO, but also a researcher. So, and there were generally kind of NGO staff present, but over time it sort of built more of a rapport with people, and we'd have more informal conversations. But obviously that's kind of a process of like reflection I'll have to look at as well throughout my kind of write-up. But yeah, I think essentially the kind of dynamic between the sort of farmers attempting to kind of own an institution, but the wider kind of livelihood challenges that people have, like there are huge water problems in the area, so only enough to grow, for example, one crop a year, depending on irrigation, mostly rain-fed agriculture. The amount of time that you could put towards an institution in terms of participation is quite small, and often that would be mediated by who could participate. Mostly, actually, the members were women, and you had some quite interesting examples of women gaining skills and confidence to sort of becoming directors of these organizations. But at the director level, it was more kind of a mixture of men and women. And then also you had the role of the NGO and the NGO staff. So I was trying to kind of reflect on not just the kind of quantitative, like who makes the decisions in kind of who is the director, but also the kind of more informal influencing type of stuff, which was quite difficult and still trying to look at. And then my own role and my ability to actually try and understand that. So, and then you have the companies, and there you have global price pressures and that kind of thing. They would form these partnerships ostensibly with the producer company, but via the NGOs or other supply chain companies, with this kind of social, I suppose, responsibility agenda. But at the same time, they need to secure a guaranteed supply of organic cotton in a fragmented supply chain. So you'd often have all these different dynamics. And there'd be different ways of mitigating things occasionally, depending on how it works. But it's quite hard to kind of have a multinational retail kind of conglomerate and a sort of producer company from a kind of district in a state for small and marginal farmers, the power symmetries are quite glaring. So, but, yeah.
You hear me? My name is Rachia. I have a question for Maya. I'm sorry I missed your presentation earlier this morning, but I'm really interested on how you see probably any incentives that the donor or international organizations could provide to the local level, to the local agent, that they can provide more cooperations or either leadership from the local agents to have you have promote coordinations, a better coordination cooperation with international organizations or donor with the local leaders. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I think yeah. So there's more in the paper that I've tried to kind of explore what this looks like. I think the issue for me is that donors, if they can kind of try and think about what their motivations are, and perhaps if their motivation and their information show that they don't actually know what the ideal policy is either, then I'm suggesting that they could kind of try and find a way where they could help local leaders and local actors kind of do that search for a policy, a good policy themselves, rather than trying to preempt or kind of push that in any direction that the donors think that they already know. And so there's various ways that they can do that, but it's kind of a general idea. It's like should provide an enabling environment for leaders and to try and make a better connections between leaders and citizens, rather than trying to pull that accountability and pull those decisions in the direction of the donor.
Right, so I think we probably need to bring the session to a close, but thank you very much to everyone who's contributed, particularly our three presenters. I can applaud in real life, but I think everyone else has to put all their applause emojis in the chat bar. So we are going to resume after lunch at 2 o'clock. It would be great if the presenters from this morning can come back if they're free to join a closing panel at the end where we can review some of the lessons learned across the two panels. And obviously it would be great to see audience members again. And if you had a question that you weren't able to ask in this session, please hang on to it because you will have a bit more time at the end of the next one. So thanks again to everyone, including Amal, who's lurking in the sidebar, but still here as well. And our very patient volunteer, Bella, who's been supporting us on the technical side. So hopefully see you all at 2. Thank you again.
Thank you.